It is wonderful to be here. I have been looking forward to this visit for so long, just because this is the Cotswolds and such an idyllic place to live. And then you arrive and you're at this beautiful manor house. So I want to hear just a little bit about the history of it, what it's like living here, running it. So should we rewind? History.
Okay.
When you arrived.
Okay. So, no, well, you arrive sideways on, and this little house tucked away in these deep valleys. And of course, history in a way passed its by. It went into this suspended animation through the 19th century with the decline of the woolen cloth industry, which was the beginning of it all, and depopulation here and everything. And then the Cotswolds became trendy, as it were, towards the end of the 19th century, were discovered by prosonical dons from Oxford, and artists and writers began to settle here. And it was described in the early country life as England's terrain. It suddenly became seen as this sort of beautiful region which was kind of accessible, because you could get here from Birmingham, and they'd invented railways, you could get here from everywhere. And Owlpen became a kind of, use the awful word, iconic country house, again, a tiny house, but it had somehow survived the centuries intact. It's virtually unaltered since these sash windows, 1719, a little attempt at modernisation after a sort of good harvest or something. And the fellow who did that, he laid out the garden with nice gate piers and steps and a little bit of axial symmetry. And then he died in 1748, and we think the house really wasn't lived in, and our children were brought up here, probably the first generation to have been raised here since then.
Oh my goodness.
And we came here, as we say somewhere, with 2 dogs, 2 goats and a baby. Not Hugo. And then we went on to have 5 children, and we've now got, I was corrected yesterday, a tribe really we are, of 28 people. We hardly fit in the house, all the attics are full. And
how wonderful. So, and that's what's...
It's a place full of life and activity, you know, again. So that's all, you know, we've been very lucky. We didn't know any of that when we came here. I was brought up in the North Cotswolds, which is a more fashionable, or was the end of it. And this is all, it was much more rural, these deep hills, sort of bad farmland in a way, and you could see the sheep. There's a sense of the eternal, isn't there?
Yes.
It's bucolic.
It's so wonderful, and as you said, you know, there's 28 of you now. You came with just a few animals and a child, and you've really expanded, and that's what's so wonderful about these historic houses, is that they're lived in family homes, here to preserve history, but also at the same time to celebrate the architecture, the fabric of the buildings, and to be able to allow the public to also share in that as well.
And I've got a sense that early houses, this is an early house, 1450, a rebuild in the Tudor times of a medieval house, but are much more adaptable than the grand Victorian Georgian houses that my forebears lived in, which were dependent on armies of servants and rather ritual, hierarchical lifestyle. Whereas here we just all muck in, and you know, we have to round up the sheep one day or do television the next.
Yes, well, that's exactly
it's all
right.
in a day's work, really.
That sun has decided to grace us.
Might.
How wonderful is that? But so when you arrived, though, and you've expanded the family, you know, that sort of, I want to fast forward a little bit. You've got this idyllic Cotswolds manor house, and you decided it's also a business, right? So you've come on board, Hugo, in one sense. And when did you decide to open it up to the public, or had it always been like that?
Well, our predecessors got grants to do roofs and things, and the condition, strings attached, were to open the house in a very modest way on Fridays in June and July. And, and they said, kind of, we'd like you to try carrying it on. And then we started having lots of children and baby. It became impossible, and we closed the house, really. And at that time, the microeconomy of the farm, the estate, was much more viable than today. Today, it's just a question of almost keeping it there.
Yes, yes.
But it doesn't really contribute in any way. So we evolved towards it, I suppose. We started opening the house bit by bit, and since then, it's evolved more towards events, weddings. We have non-commercial things like concerts. We're having an artist residency next week. You know, we never know what.
I think my father's being very modest. I mean, one of the important things is that my mother is an extremely good cook, and
Right.
We had all this holiday accommodation, and you need more than just houses, and so they opened a restaurant in the barn, and my mother was the cook for 20 years there. And so we used to have the house open to the public, and we did cream teas and lunches, and then everyone from the holiday cottage would come and have dinner. And so it was busy all the time, and we all used to work in the tea room,
Right.
serving teas and washing up and all the rest of it when we were children, and we were room guides in the house when we weren't doing that. So we all sort of, I mean, for example, on an Easter Sunday, we would all go and do lunch and then do the house opening, and after that we do the Easter egg hunt when everyone had left.
Right.
And so it was very much a sort of family-run little business which was trying to find ways to survive.
Yes.
While also not putting so much pressure on the house that the whole place fell down.
Right.
And that worked for a while, but then it came to a point where actually, I don't know how it is in Mapperton, but Owlpen's almost too small for that sort of business to be viable. So we sort of pivoted into private events, many of which are weddings, because this place, as my father was saying, it lends itself to private parties, and the farm is basically unviable now, but it means that you've got this great sort of shelter belt. People can come here and be private and have a lovely weekend here and have a great time in the barns and the gardens, and that works really well and use all the accommodation. So it's about finding ways to allow us still to live here,
Yes.
while not sort of losing the atmosphere and the heart of the place, you know,
Yes.
and maintaining this sense of a lived-in house at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. We've had to really continue to evolve from the time that really the historic house had to, many of them had to open up their doors, especially after the Second World War. You know, that's when we started to see this trend of historic houses opening their doors to the public so that they could still live, but live in a different way, but also keeping the integrity of the house. And as you mentioned, it is, of course, finding that right balance of how many visitors do I want in my house because of the wear and tear. And that's what I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand, that having thousands of visitors in your house is wear and tear, and then that's another repair bill somewhere further down the line. And how are you going to pay for that repair bill? Well, you have to figure out and evolve and come up with different ideas. And as you've just, so beautifully put, it's sort of looking at what works, what has worked, what's not working, and shifting and evolving.
Yeah.
And it was a very English thing at the time, because in Sweden nobody opens their house to the public, and it was considered rather vulgar, and people didn't really quite know how to. And I think the attitude was different of the visitors, of a sort of curiosity and nostalgia.
Yes.
How do the upper classes live, kind of thing. It was, whereas now there's a much more informed interest in architectural history and social history.
There is.
Of a young generation who can be really enthusiastic about the heritage. But the other thing is that the house is also the focus of a community, and has always been, and it provides jobs and a sort of dynamic to the whole,
Yes.
wider economy. And the cottages were partly a thing of maintaining these old buildings, which had no function. They were part of the feudal estate when staff lived in them, or some were just derelict, some didn't really exist. But and there was just beginning to be this idea people wanted to stay in what the English used to call self-catering. They now
Yes.
talk about Airbnb. We didn't like the term self-catering, and so we did up these historic buildings. Luckily, we did them at the time when it was, you got more bang for your buck. We did completely rebuilt these old buildings, and that's been a great satisfaction, really, because they now have a use and
Yes.
and they're enjoyed. People come here from all over the world, They come for their
Yes.
honeymoons, and then their children come, and they
Yeah.
come
Well,
for an entire life cycle,
and that's what's, and also you're in this sort of picturesque Cotswolds, and that even me as the American know about the Cotswolds, of course. Before I moved over here, it was a destination. Now, Lady Amanda, I do want to ask you, because like me, you didn't come from from Britain, and I've had to sort of through trial and error navigate this sort of Britishness and these manor houses, and just wondering what it was like for you to step into these shoes of Britishness.
I think it was I don't think I realized what we took on. It's sort of, whoa, we've got this big house, and we're going to have big parties, we're going to dress up for dinner every night. Well, nothing about that happened ever, obviously. And then we sort of started the farm, so I started doing the lambing. So we were, it's sort of things that I had never had any idea that I would ever do.
Yes.
So just all new, but it was very exciting.
Yeah.
And I think I got into it quite quickly.
Yes. And how long when did you arrive to the UK?
1969.
Okay. With your English, you have the Swedish accent on your
You never get
English.
rid of that.
It's brilliant. I know. People say to me all the time, you've been here for so long, why don't you have a British accent?
You can't.
No.
No, you can't.
Why would
Well,
you
unless you
want to?
train to it, then there's no reason for it.
Yes, exactly. But I think things, as you've mentioned, have also, again, shifted in particular after the Second World War. Same with me. You have this sort of illusion as somebody who's an outsider marrying in. You're thinking parties.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Yeah.
Never
happened.
Never happened. Never happened. We do most of it, if not all of it, ourselves, and it is very much hands-on, involving, the wider family.
The other thing is that you end up doing all the jobs that no one else wants to do. So if there are drains to be rodded, you're the one who has to rod the drains, because no one else is going to do it.
It's so true.
It doesn't matter if you're notionally the boss or not. You're essentially the dog's buddy. You've become the sort of bottom of the pile, because you've got to just sort of get on with it and do whatever needs to be done.
Yeah.
So you get to the end of every day having achieved nothing that you hope to achieve, but being really busy all the time, and you wonder whether that's even productive. But,
Have you met my husband yet? You guys would have a fantastic chat.
Our family gave a house to the National Trust, where they have a completely different way of doing things, and armies of specialists, whereas we have to do everything on the sort of level of conservation or garden design or catering or health and safety, and you're wearing all these hats all the time.
Yes.
And obviously you can't be good at all of them, but we do have things that we prefer doing.
I think it's the lived-in thing
Yes.
that everybody. When people came around the house and they would see a flex coming out of the bed, which was the the blanket,
Yes.
They would say, "Does anybody live here?" And you're going, "Oh, no." I'm sure you get that too.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. It's but they like it that it's lived in, though. I think
Oh,
that
definitely.
they-
No,
that's
definitely.
so wonderful when they see the family photographs and they see the toy that you're like, oh, you're giving a tour and you need to kick it underneath the bed because, yes, that was. But can I, when I arrived today, I walked through your fantastic, glorious gardens, and you mentioned, Nicholas, earlier the gardens beforehand, but were these the original gardens?
Well, it's said that Geoffrey Jellicoe, who was a great garden historian, said he thought this was the earliest garden in England, that it's somehow a survival of a medieval garden within these coped stone walls, and it rises on 7 terraces, which is symbolic, with the church on the top terrace.
Right.
But I think it's been laid out in the early 18th century. It was rearranged with the yews planted. They've grown up there into what we call now the yew parlour. They would have just been accents in a parterre at the edge of the garden.
Right.
We know that the man who built the garden bought a pair of shears, and he probably was trimming his yews. And so it was when we arrived, the house, as I say, hadn't been lived in the 19th century. So there was nothing here. And we gradually started digging up paths, and people said, "You're mad, we'll all be in our bath chairs by the time these little boxes have grown up into hedges." But we went ahead, and we have, it's slightly historicist, I suppose, that it was built in the 1980s, and you know,
Right.
I was very interested in Italian gardens and looked at early gardens which don't really survive in England because we swept them away when landscape gardens came.
Yes, yes.
So we've enjoyed doing all that. It is quite formal. It has this access to the other side, and we're now planning to put a flagpole up there for the coronation, because we thought we should really have
Yes.
a flag. My great-grandparents always had the thing,
Like all the Swedes.
put the flag up,
Right.
like
Yeah.
at the armistice,
Yes.
which told the village that they must have had a telephone or something. They somehow knew that war was over before
Right,
anyone
right,
else
yes,
did.
yes.
And then you put the flag up, and then everybody knew. It was all that kind of thing.
Wonderful.
So yes, it goes on with funny little ideas.
And do you remember, Hugo, your parents, were you around when your parents decided, right, we're going to sort of just, well, I'll use the American term, flatten this and rebuild?
Yeah, I hated it because, from my perspective, as a child, you want tarmac where you can ride your bike, and a lawn where you can play football. And suddenly the lawn is dug up, and you've got all these paths. You're not allowed to run on the paths. You're not allowed to jump over them. It was from a child's perspective, it was a disaster. They'd ruined the garden. So I didn't understand until a lot later that it was actually an improvement. To me,
Yes.
it was not progress at all. They'd wrecked this wonderful garden that was great to play in. So
Right.
yeah, it's funny how your attitudes change over the years.
Yes, no, of course. I mean, it's absolutely stunning.
We were quite strict. We'd say, "Don't run, don't laugh,
Don't have fun.
Don't
have
breathe."
fun."
Don't play football. And now I say the same thing to my children. So yeah.
Yes,
it carries on.
I mean, it's wonderful. And, you know, when I married into, you know, the Montagu family and moved to Mapperton, which is, again, another manor house, for me, perhaps one of the questions that I always wanted to have answered when you've got sort of, in England, you have castles, you have stately homes, you have halls, you have courts, and then you have this manor house.
Yeah.
And what exactly makes up a manor house, the elements around
Well, I
the
think
manor
it's a very
house?
ancient thing. With the Norman conquest, it was the Roman villa, and it was actually a unit of administration. This is what's called a gentry manor, which meant that the lord of the manor lived here, as opposed to there were aristos who owned lots of manors and just took rents and never had anything to, didn't even know where they were.
Right.
So, and they went on the Crusades, they went to Cressy and so on, where the feudal overlords were in the big castle nearby, Berkeley Castle, and they had their own court. There was a manorial court, and we have the court rolls telling of fines that they administered, and if somebody inherited a tenant farm, they had to pay what was called heriot to the lord of the manor, which was like the best cow or something like that. He'd say, "Sorry, I'll have that," and all that kind of thing. So it was a legal system as well as just a name. And I think in this part of Gloucestershire, the manor house is often called a court. And this, I don't know whether people really, the manor was the legal thing, really.
Right,
And then
right.
here we have the church, the barn, the mill, the open fields on the tops of the hills, the strip lynchets along the banks, and the cottages. All the elements of the manor are here, including the courthouse, which is a little building on the west side, where apparently the court baron or court halimote was held, with the lord of the manor presiding, and they'd have a judge would sometimes be brought out. It was quite serious sometimes.
Yes.
And if you'd done a terrible crime, you were then sent up to the 100 Court, and maybe if you were going to be hanged, you'd go to the Shire Court in the capital of the county, which had, and then judges would go round on assize and try the important cases.
I think the thing that makes Owlpen also interesting in that context is that if you stand on the lawn looking at the house, you can see the courthouse, the mill house, the farm, everything that makes the manor is still here, the church, and also in business terms the barn. And of course,
Yes.
barns, whereas before they were just places where you would use it for threshing or storage, now they're crucially important to these sorts of places because they are events venues.
Yes.
And you can repurpose them as something completely different. And now they're great for, if you think of the wassails people used to have in barns, now it's weddings and discos and conferences and all that sort of thing. So they serve a modern purpose. So the traditional medieval manor has sort of morphed into something completely different, but it still looks very similar to how it would have been 500 years ago, which is quite fun.
I mean, that is perfectly put, and you've described it so eloquently and so beautifully, because for me, when you were putting that in such a wonderful way, I was envisioning Mapperton, because of course Mapperton is, and you mentioned court. When I look back at letters about 100 years ago and through the archives, it's referenced as Mapperton Court. And then obviously it's a manor house, it's Mapperton, just like Owlpen Manor, Mapperton. But you have all those elements there. You have the church, you have the farm, we have a schoolhouse, we have all these different elements that makes it, again, what makes a manor house, and it's not just the house. It's these elements put together.
Absolutely, and there was a little school, and there was also the parson who paid for a lot of these things out of his own pocket, because he was the only educated person, lord of the manor, who went to Oxford and London. You know, they were in touch with a wider world, which they brought here in their person, in a way. So,
it's fantastic. Well, I would love to see more of what makes a manor house a manor as far as the interiors.
And I think also it's expressed in the architecture. So this isn't, although it's described as a tiny manor house, a farmhouse wouldn't have been allowed to have, say, a bay window or an oriel window. That was definitely expression of status.
Yes.
And your coat of arms on the front of the house. You see, the farmers didn't have coats of arms. It was expressed itself as, you know, it's not a huge house by country house standards, but it was definitely the house.
Right. Yes.
For miles around.
Yeah, and it has the markings on it to say, I am, you know, a powerful house.
Relatively.
Exactly.